Better Buildings for Humans is powered by Advanced Glazings, makers of the Solera line of products. Solera is the leading glass glazing made specifically for architectural daylighting and with extreme insulation performance. Learn more at advancedglazings.com.
Hello, and welcome to this week's episode of Better Buildings for Humans. I am your host, Joe Menchefski, and this is the podcast where we talk about the impact that the built environment has on our health, our wellness, our productivity, our general joy of being alive. And of course, we always have to talk about sustainability as well. And today, I finally, after many months of begging, I finally got Lauren Ferguson from the T.H. Chan School of Public Health today. Lauren, welcome. It's an absolute thrill to finally get to speak with you.
No, thank you so much for having me. It's my pleasure to be here.
Yeah, it's wonderful. We always start by learning a little bit about our guests. So why don't you tell us what brought you into the world of environmental engineering, and then tell us about the kind of projects that you've worked on in the past, and then finish with, what you're doing now or recently and now with the T.H. Chan School of Public Health.
Sure, absolutely. So I guess you could say I kind of fell into environmental engineering. So I initially majored in biochemistry in the UK, but I never really had an aptitude for wet lab work. So I kind of veered more towards the computational side. So during my graduate degree, I used a lot of programming tools like R and Python, and kind of figured that was the methods that I would kind of want to use throughout my career. And then all throughout this time, I had a lay interest in buildings. And if I would travel anywhere on vacation, I would always try and visit the most interesting, be it historically or architectural building in the region. And then when I was kind of looking for my postgrad studies, there was this option for a PhD in environmental engineering that was computational in nature. And so I already had some of the necessary skill set to do the work, but maybe not the understanding was quite there. And so they offered me a joint master's PhD program, which kind of got me up to speed on the background information and the theory. And that's how I ended up in environmental engineering. And so my PhD looked at childhood exposure to air pollution in London. And it was mainly, I used a building physics tool called Energy Plus. You might have. So I used that a lot for my PhD. And then after that, I stayed in London for an extra year and was kind of working on different projects. One of them was for the UK government, which was looking at overheating in, we don't have air conditioning in the UK. So it was trying to manage indoor heat in the UK using passive solutions, because they were kind of worried there's going to be this big rush for air conditioning. We hit 100 and do you use Celsius or?
I speak Celsius.
Yeah,
I'm bilingual. I can speak Fahrenheit or Celsius.
We hit 40 degrees in London in 2022, which is 105 Fahrenheit, which was unprecedented. So at the time, the government was trying to manage indoor heat, and I worked on a project kind of modelling indoor heat in the future across the UK building stock. And then some of the more niche projects that I've worked on, again, while I was still based in London, was when I looked at indoor air pollution in informal settlements in Kenya. And that was a really interesting project and a totally different setting, totally different, had to completely change the way I thought about buildings, because these are informal buildings with salvage materials. And then now at the Chan, so I moved to Boston in September 2023. So I've been there for a little over a year, and the work there has been primarily focused on, again, it's a lot of modelling. So I work a lot with buildings, but I don't think you would catch me on a building site or in a hard hat. But we've been looking at modelling, well, most recently infiltration from outdoor wildfire smoke, and trying to estimate a cost benefit analysis of installing filters in US homes to limit wildfire smoke infiltration.
Wonderful. Okay, there's a lot there. First of all, I have to say, I live in Nova Scotia. Air
Mhm.
conditioning is a relatively new thing here as
Okay.
well. There was no air conditioning when I was growing up. There was no air conditioning,
Mhm.
well into my 20s and 30s even. So it's a relatively new thing. So let's go right to the Healthy Buildings program.
Yeah.
Broadly speaking, how do you define a healthy building?
Yeah. So I guess it's most like basic. A healthy building is any kind of building which promotes the health and well-being of occupants, and it encourages social interaction, and there's no exposures that can like harm the occupants. But I think more what my interests in like healthy buildings are those that have minimal impact on the environment, and they actually like exploit the natural elements of where they're located, because we as humans have like evolved. We already have everything we need, like fresh air, sunlight, and I think the best kind of building exploits those natural elements. So it used where possible. In some areas of the world, it's not always possible, but like using solar gains for heat and natural daylight exposure, and trying to exploit like stack ventilation for airflow and cooling. That to me would be like a healthy building.
Okay, wonderful. Let's talk about IEQ. You talked about smoke. I learned a little bit about smoke. I'm a co-founder in a company that makes scent-free cleaning products, and we could never come up with something to deal with fire damage because the particulate is so large. But we'll come back to that. First, let's talk about IEQ. What are the primary factors that drive indoor environmental quality?
So I think different features of building performance are important to different people. So for me, thermal comfort's like I'm just like a naturally cold person, and if I feel cold in a space, then I'm not comfortable. I just won't choose to be in that space for an extended period of time. And following that, it's like daylight exposure and then high air quality, so air that's free of particulates and VOCs. I think some people, acoustic comfort is very important. I'd say all of these would rank quite high for most people. And then there's kind of more lower tier things that I think make a space nice to be in. So like biophilic design, adequate like room that can encourage like movement and social interaction. So like primary for me, and I think for most people, is is it thermally comfortable? Is the air safe to breathe and free of contaminants? Is the acoustic quality high? And then once you have these things, you get the more kind of nice to have features, like, is does it have a nice biophilic design? Is it orientated in a way that encourages social interaction?
I like that hierarchy a lot. Can we talk about smoke a little bit?
Mm-hmm.
I hadn't really planned for this, but I really want to talk about that. It's such an important topic these days, and I didn't realize that that's where a lot of your time is being spent right now. What are the biggest dangers of smoke penetration into a home or into a building where we work?
I think with the wildfire smoke that's sadly happening at the minute, there's a lot that's coming out about these kind of toxic metals that's in this like burnt debris. So lead, arsenic, and these all form components of like PM2.45, but are on their own like very toxic. And there's also, it's like trying to understand what is actually coming off some of the, because in a situation where people's whole like homes have been burnt down, and you get a lot of burnt like building debris, like the scariest thing is that I think they're not always sure exactly what is coming off those objects. And I think there's a push to understand exactly just how toxic the components of PM2.5 are.
PM 2.5, I'm sorry to interrupt, Lauren, but
No,
can you
no.
please define that for us?
So PM2.5 is particulate matter that is equal to or smaller than 2.5 micrograms. So it's really small. And the idea is that it can penetrate really far into your airways and lungs. And so it's toxic to us.
Okay. Really sorry to interrupt. Most of us wouldn't know that terminology. Please continue. We were discussing, you talked about the heavy metals, and then you were moving on to some other, the fact that we don't know what's in a
Yeah.
lot of this smoke.
And I think trying to like at the minute there's been a push to try and understand what exactly it is that's in this like wildfire PM, and how is it more toxic than just regular PM from like car exhaust, and how can, because in these areas of the world where the burned area is huge, how can we stop that smoke from infiltrating to areas beyond the affected area? So I know that's kind of in the last few weeks even what some of my work has been kind of moved towards. Yeah.
Now, if the particle doesn't contain heavy metals, but is still, a potentially large, relatively large particle, is that without the metals, is it still a threat to our health to be breathing in those kinds of particles?
Yeah, I think with PM, there's kind of a lot of unknowns on like exactly what species within PM is causing the harm, and it's hard to like disentangle. But basically, anything that gets into your airways that shouldn't be there is harmful.
Right. Okay. So what are you finding with regards to filters and filtration? Is it something that is going to be recommended as a way of dealing with these fires, the smoke from these fires?
Yeah, I mean, it's very recent work, so we haven't got any solid results yet. At the minute, we're working on trying to do like a cost benefit analysis to see if the reduction in PM could be scaled out and would lead to like quite a big benefit in exposure for people. And the findings are still TBD. We've done some work in schools not based in the US, actually in Tanzania, and we've been finding that it leads to quite a measurable reduction of indoor PM in schools. But obviously a school building houses like 60 kids or so. So in that situation, it probably is like cost effective to install one there. So at the minute, we're trying to do the modeling to see if it would be effective to roll out across homes where maybe there's only like 3 people living. If the reduction in indoor PM is enough to see a measurable effect in population exposure over a region.
Do you want to bring lots of healthy, beautiful natural light in your building and still meet energy codes? Try Solera from Advanced Glazings. Learn more at advancedglazings.com. Okay, let's circle back to something you mentioned in your introduction, and that was your PhD program. I thought that was really interesting. You were at the University College of London, and you studied childhood exposure to pollution, or was it to heat? Which I trying to
Childhood
remember.
exposure to pollution, yeah. The work
Yeah.
after was to heat, yeah.
Okay. Now, you were looking at the correlation between socioeconomic status and exposure to pollution. Can you tell us a little bit about the objectives and the methodology? And let's talk about the outcome too.
So the objectives were to create a modelling tool which could estimate childhood exposure to particulates for the London child population. So it was for school-age children from like 4 to 16 in London. And from that, create this kind of tool that would estimate exposure for each person in that population. And how I did that was used a combination of these building physics tools. So we have like national building surveys in the UK, which they'll do like a full building survey for a few thousand homes, and the homes will be selected to be representative. They have them in the US as well. And they record things like the overall size, the materials, the ventilation type, what else? I'm thinking of the US one, but they didn't have it. So they'll have things like a thermostat set point. You can estimate the window to wall ratio. And so I took this building survey and put it into a building physics software, Energy Plus. I think I mentioned it earlier.
Yep.
So from that, we have like a representative sample of homes for London, like building models for homes. And these national building surveys also record who actually lives in these homes, not so you could identify them, but like it's like, oh, it's a family of 4 and it's 2 parents and 2 kids kind of thing. So you've got an idea of the kind of homes where kids are located in London. And then from there, we linked that to an outdoor concentration for that home. And then also we didn't have detailed information for the school. So I used like a statistical technique, which kind of did some microenvironmental modeling based on like building air change rates recorded in UK schools. And then it was kind of more simple mass balance model. And the idea was that you could simulate like a child's exposure, like going to school. So you'd have like in the morning at home, their commute to school whilst they were at the school. And then, so that was like the overarching kind of aim of the work. And then was to use that tool to look at different like interventions. So like more hard interventions in terms of like building envelope upgrades, or more kind of soft policy interventions like behavioural changes. And so we also compared like how children, because we knew the kind of socioeconomic status of their home, how kids from different like socioeconomic groups compared. And I think it feels like a long time ago now, but the main finding of the work was that in like a city that's as kind of polluted and populated as London, all kids, I think it was like 70% of kids had a daily exposure which was higher than recommended levels by the WHO. And that was regardless of like their socioeconomic status. Like there was some gradient, like kids from the highest socioeconomic group did fare like quite a lot better. But after that, it was kind of like none of it was that good, I guess.
So does that tell you that it's more driven by external factors rather than factors in the home? Is that a fair extrapolation?
I think, yeah, I think it was more that in these cities where there's like really high density, so in like London or somewhere like New York City, it's quite hard to like, I think my closing kind of thoughts in my thesis were like, it becomes really hard to buy your way out of like poor environmental conditions. Like all homes are located near really polluted roads, and all, space requirements mean that homes, you might live in like a fancier apartment, but it's still, the internal volume is probably not that much different than like in somewhere in a less kind of fancy affluent area. And so that was my kind of interpretation of the findings. That's why we had this like one group which had quite a lot better air quality, but then it was kind of mixed in after that top kind of 10%.
You said you can't buy your way out of bad environmental conditions. That is a incredibly profound statement. So there's no need to elaborate on it because it speaks for itself. But my goodness, what a profound statement. And it's one we should all be paying attention to, all of us. Let's talk about mental health outcomes. There's growing evidence that links indoor air quality to mental health outcomes. Can you elaborate on this connection first, and then maybe talk about the implications for public health policies and building design?
Yes, so in the indoor environment, and my team at Harvard has done quite a lot of work on this before I actually joined, but there's evidence that links poor indoor air quality with short-term effects on cognition. So we see that children in classrooms and office workers in offices with higher CO2 levels perform worse on tests. And I think this could have a big impact I was going to maybe talk about this later as well, but the pandemic, I think, really opened people's eyes to the impact of like poor indoor air quality. And I think for the first time, people were like very aware that just because we can't like see something, it doesn't necessarily mean that it's not having like an impact on us. And I think schools in particular, that like caught the attention of schools in particular, because it was like, okay, schools can be like a hotspot for these like infection outbreaks. And I think it's true also, like if you have poor indoor air quality in a classroom, it's not like when it's at home where it's affecting like 2 or 3 people. It's like there's 30 kids that could all be being affected by this, and they spend like a third of their waking life in this classroom. So I think there is a push. I know there's quite a lot of work going on at the Harvard Chan that are looking at indoor air quality in schools. With mental health, So I've talked about reduced cognition, but in the outdoor environment, there's now quite strong evidence of more severe mental health outcomes, such as like anxiety and depression. Though because of the chronic nature of these conditions, it's hard to acquire like long-term indoor air quality data to make a link. But I do think it's interesting that usually what we see in the outdoor, that kind of research reaches the indoor after like a decade, just because it's hard to get like long-term indoor air quality monitoring data. And I do wonder if someone at some point is going to make that, if there's going to be like a link made between indoor air quality and more kind of severe mental health impacts. I'd be interested to see that if it came out.
Well, I hope there's somebody working on that. As a matter of fact, I'm going to go do some research myself and see if I can get a guest to speak about that. I mean, the thing that kicked off this show for me, Lauren, like the reason I wanted to do it, and format it the way I do is that you hear there's a million podcasts talking about nutrition.
Yeah.
Right. And the impact that it has on our health and exercise. Oh my God, all the exercise podcasts, which is
there's
great.
So many like Netflix things about nutrition and exercise. And people really are into it. But yeah, there's still so much going on in like the environmental. Yeah.
Exactly. It's just not being spoken of. And so the things that you're talking about today are just, oh my God, they're just so important. Well, let's just ask the question, what's the most pressing challenge right now in ensuring healthy environments?
Yeah. So I think the biggest challenge, and it's something that me and my like colleagues in Boston have been trying to kind of work out, is how do you try and influence the way people behave in their homes? Like, so some of the work in my PhD suggested that residential sources of air pollution were a significant contributor to exposure, mainly from cooking emissions. And it's never going to be popular to tell people how to behave in their homes. Like, we've seen it when, there was like pushback online not that long ago, when there was more research on the gas stove debate. And it was like, gas stoves can be bad for you. And people were like, oh, they're coming after gas stoves now. And I get it, because I myself actually prefer to cook on a gas stove as opposed to an induction stove. And I'm aware of all the risks. And I think trying to communicate those risks without coming across like you're giving people yet more, because I think people have like attention overload at the minute, and it's like, oh, this is another thing. There's like climate change. We just got over a pandemic. There's like wider political things that are going on that may or may not like threaten like population health. And then you're like, oh, now we need to worry about what kind of like stove we're using, or like now I need to make sure I'm ventilating my property right. And I just think trying to reach people without seeming like you're giving them yet another thing they need to be conscious of or worried about, I just think that's a huge challenge, especially because indoor air quality is so linked to behavior.
Oh, look, people don't want to be talked at right now.
Yeah.
Right? They don't want to be lectured right now. It's the worst time to attempt to change attitudes would be right about now. But my goodness, it's so important. Is there a push with, the government in the UK? I don't hear it much in Canada, and I definitely don't hear it in the US. Do you hear anything in the UK, or maybe you've got some connections in Europe where they're talking about changes that could improve, the air in our homes?
So the UK government not long brought out like a indoor overheating guidelines. So they're very aware that,
right,
we don't have mechanical cooling. So they are like, I think there is some recognition that, our indoor environmental quality is important. I don't know. The London mayor, like a lot comes out of the mayor's office to do with outdoor air quality. And I think, again, they're also aware of like the outdoor-indoor interface. But I think it is because of like, it's just never going to be popular to try and tell people what to do in their homes. And in like liberal democracies, people do what's popular,
Right. Yeah, oh, absolutely. And they kind of have to deal with the acute things, but if it's not acute, yeah, it's a tough go, especially right now. Let's change gears entirely, just because there's other things I wanted to make sure we talk about while we're together. Conflicts. For anyone who's listened to the show before, I love exploring conflicts, and especially the one between energy management and human health or human-centric design. Is there a conflict between indoor air quality and energy reduction goals?
So I think there can be, because, sometimes improving indoor air quality can require increased ventilation or air filtration, humidity control, and these consume energy. Whereas, like, in an energy efficient building, you're trying to minimize all those things like heating and cooling and ventilation loads. And I think the key thing, and I kind of said this at the beginning, like, is the best kind of buildings I've ever been in are ones that really try and exploit the the outdoor conditions. And I think if you design a building to, like, be in harmony with those outdoor environmental conditions, and it's not always possible, I appreciate that, but you take full advantage of, like, the hours of sunlight, how low the sun is in the sky, to maximize, like, solar gains. I think that's, like, the best, to try and strike those two things of being energy efficient and, like, optimizing the actual building envelope. It doesn't always have to be in conflict, but it often is. And I think it's hard to get, especially depending on where you are in the world, like, it's hard to meet those two things.
Yeah, absolutely. What are the big unknowns in air quality research these days? There's got to be some big dark corners that we haven't shone light into yet. What would those be, in your opinion?
I think what maybe a little bit what we talked about is that indoor air quality research, we still have very little longitudinal cohort data of the impact on indoor air pollution and health outcomes. Like, we know outdoor air pollution is linked, so, like, we talked about mental health, quite severe mental health problem. All of those studies are done with, like, outdoor air pollution data. And so I think we're always assuming that long-term exposure to indoor air pollution has a health impact, but the research to support this largely uses outdoor air pollution. There are a couple I've seen that have indoor air quality data, but it's difficult to get those, like, long cohort data. I've had, like, monitors, like indoor monitors in my own, like, apartment for, like, a year, several times actually, in London, in Boston. And I think it's changing as you kind of get the low cost, less invasive sensors. But I had these things, they were like this big. I could see how it would be impractical long term, in a home with, like, a family or kids, or because at the time it was just me, and I was like, oh, this is kind of annoying. And it kind of made a whirring sound, these indoor air quality monitors. So I think trying to get indoor exposure data for these long-term cohort studies is a big priority, and also that represents, like, a greatest unknown.
Short lifespan single-use plastic glazing is not a sustainable solution for daylighting. Solera is the glass-based alternative for the new millennium. Learn more at advancedglazings.com. Okay. Now, I'd love to hear a little bit more. We're getting close to the end, but I'd love to hear just a little bit more of the areas of research that are taking place at the School of Public Health. Like, broadly speaking, can you just tell us about, give us a list of the areas of interest that are happening right now?
Yeah, so I know there's, like, a notable interest at the minute in, like, these forever chemicals, the PFAS.
Yeah.
They're, like, found in a lot of consumer products. I think the epidemiological evidence says that they're toxic, but they're so ubiquitous in everything. Like, they're in drinking water, they're in the clothes that we wear. So I think there's a lot of buzz around that. Recently, there's been a huge, like, 360 because of the wildfire smoke on the West Coast. Continued interest in heat exposure, especially in, like, vulnerable populations, like manual laborers that work outside that are, like, exposed to heat all day. Infectious disease is still of interest, especially, I know in my team at Harvard, I don't necessarily work on this, but there's a continuous, like, infectious disease model and trying to adapt it for different environments in case because you don't know if there's going to be another, I mean, touch wood, but there might be another pandemic, and trying to have that preparedness. Yeah, I think there's a lot of, like, modeling going on, trying to model infectious disease outbreaks and model interventions. It's great to actually do, like, field work and field data, but it's harder to get the resources and the time to do that. I know my team at Harvard. Some of them just flew out to LA to do some kind of sampling there. And I'm really excited to see what that data looks like.
Yeah, fantastic. All right. So we've reached the point in the show, Lauren, where I ask the $1 million question that I ask of every guest.
Yeah.
And I ask every guest to answer it from whatever perspective they'd like.
Yeah.
What makes a great building?
I think what makes a great building I think I've spoke about this a lot, and I think it's just where my own interests lie in like optimizing building envelopes, is one that like respects the wider climate around it and tries to utilize and exploit some of those features of the outdoor climate to meet some of its like demands in terms of heating and cooling demand, daylight requirements, natural ventilation. That is to me what makes a great building. And I think also from a social side, I think it's one that encourages and like promotes like social interaction. So these kind of like huge mixed use buildings that you see here, and there's a couple, I'm trying to think of an actual example. They just built a new shopping centre in Cambridge in Massachusetts, and it's like in a residential area, but it's not too imposing that it's like huge and kind of stands out against the residences. And something like that, I think it like backs out onto a lake, onto the river, something like that. I think that makes a great building.
Wonderful. Lauren, thank you so much for your time. It was worth the wait. It took us a while to actually connect, and I'm so glad we got to have this conversation.
Thank you so much for having me. No, I'm really happy we made it work eventually.
Please, let's stay in touch.
Yeah, I'll definitely join for some of your future podcasts. Like, I'll be listening out for you.
Wonderful. And if you have any exciting new research that comes out, let me know. We'll have you back on the show. All right.
Will do. That's great.
All right. Thank you and take care.
See you. Take care. Bye.
Bye-bye.
We hope you enjoyed this episode of Better Buildings for Humans. For more information on the world's best light diffusing and highly insulating glass glazing, please visit advancedglazings.com.